Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into the quiet, candlelit corridors of a medieval monastery. You're walking softly, your shoes whisper across cool stone, and up ahead, behind a heavy oak door, flickers the dim light of a scriptorium. The air smells like old parchment beeswax and something vaguely metallic. Maybe rust, maybe ink, maybe both. You push open the door. A few heads turn robed monks hunched over desks, their quills scratching softly on vellum like 100 tiny feathers whispering secrets. Welcome to a world where people literally spent decades copying one book and then cried when it smudged. Tonight we're talking about ink. Yep, just ink. Specifically why medieval scribes argued about it like it was the Holy Grail in liquid form. You might think this is dull enough to knock you out instantly, and honestly, you're not wrong. But stick around, we've got moldy quills, passive-aggressive monks, and ink recipes so bizarre, you'll start to side-eye your own pen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this sleepy little global community grow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ease into the room, and already you're hit by how silent it is, except for the scratching of quills. There's something oddly soothing about it, like the medieval version of ASMR. You spot a monk wearing a slightly too tight hood leaning over a thick page. He dips his quill into an inkwell, with surgeon-like precision, draws a line, and then immediately groans. The ink was too watery. Again. You wouldn't think monks would argue about recipes like chefs on a cooking show. But here we are. These aren't just monks. They're scribes. Obsessive, ink-stained, perfectionist scribes whose entire job, often their entire life, was copying manuscripts by hand. Every letter, every illuminated swirl. And if your ink wasn't perfect, well, you'd better like starting over. Ink was sacred and maddening. Not just any ink would do. They needed it to be deep dark, and most importantly, permanent. Not fading, not flaking, not smearing. It had to survive humidity, cold, sweaty fingers, mice, centuries of candle smoke, and yes, sometimes blood from people fighting over what they thought it said. Most medieval ink, especially the kind used in monasteries, was iron gall ink. Sounds mysterious, right? It's actually made from tannins extracted from oak galls, those little weird bumps you see on oak tree leaves, plus iron salts, and a binding agent, usually gum arabic. Add water, boil, wait, strain, wait again, and boom, ink. More or less. The thing is, there wasn't one recipe. Oh no. Every monastery had their own secret blend. Some added wine instead of water. Others included vinegar, honey, even egg whites. And yes, everyone thought their version was the best. Like monks competing on medieval MasterChef, whispering Brother Thomas ruins it with too much vinegar. Historians still argue whether these recipe variations actually affected legibility, or if the debates were just glorified monastic drama. But you watch as one monk, his name might be Brother Aldrich, hard to say, with that hood leans over another's shoulder, frowns, and mutters something that sounds suspiciously like, "That's not ink, that's soup." You move to another desk. A younger monk is testing a new mixture. He dips, writes, lifts perfect. Deep black, no run, instant dry. He beams, then watches in horror as the ink changes color while drying, fading to a sickly brown. Too much iron, someone says. Not enough oak gall, says someone else. Maybe God's punishing you for skipping morning prayers, says a third. Welcome to the world of ink drama, and the stakes, higher than you'd think. Remember, paper wasn't really a thing yet in most of Europe. They wrote on parchment, processed animal skin. Imagine spending hours stretching and scraping goat hide until it's soft enough to write on, only to ruin it because your ink blotted at the wrong moment. It wasn't just frustrating, it was expensive. A single book could take years and hundreds of animals. One mistake and the whole page might have to be redone. That's when you notice something curious. On a desk in the corner, there's a page completely covered in tiny script, except for one spot where the ink's noticeably lighter. Just a single word, and under it a margin note, "This ink is wretched." Brother Hugo must have brewed it during Lent. You suppress a chuckle. Passive-aggressive footnotes, not just a modern invention. The room feels cozy in a musty parchment-scented kind of way. You glance around at all the tiny ink pots, each labeled, each carefully placed on sand trays to avoid spills. Ink was stored like fine wine, and sometimes treated like it too. Monks debated how long ink should sit before being ready. Some swore by a week. Others insisted on aging it for a month. One even claimed the best ink was left forgotten in a cool cellar for one full winter. No one could agree. And honestly, they still don't. Scholars today replicate these recipes and still debate which ones are historically accurate and which ones were just desperate monks throwing herbs in a pot and hoping for legibility. And speaking of desperation, you glance toward the back wall where a monk is sniffing an ink pot. Not drinking, just sniffing. He dips a quill, writes something, then nods solemnly. "Too much myrrh," he mutters. Myrrh in ink, why not, apparently. You get it now. Why the arguments happened. Why monks would get genuinely irritated when someone tampered with their recipe. This wasn't just writing, it was crafting something that was supposed to last forever. In a time when books were rare and precious, a good ink could mean your words survived the centuries. A bad one. Your masterpiece turns into a blotchy ghost. The candle flickers, casting dancing shadows across the pages. You sit at a desk and run your fingers along a freshly written line. Still damp. The ink smells earthy, metallic, and vaguely like old apples. You try to imagine what the monks were like in real life. Were they as solemn as they looked? Or did they laugh when someone spilled ink on their robes? Did they whisper about each other's handwriting? Brother Cedric writes like a drunken squirrel. You chuckle softly. The air feels heavier now. The scratching of quills slows. One by one, the monks close their inkwells and place lids on their pots. The fire crackles gently in the hearth. You lean back, eyelids heavy. One last thought crosses your mind before the scene dims. They weren't just copying words. They were fighting time itself with ink as their only weapon. You wake not from sleep, but from a sort of mental drifting. The kind that happens when you're surrounded by whispering candlelight, the soft shuffle of robes, and the steady tap-tap of a quill against the edge of a wooden desk. Time here isn't measured in minutes, but in paragraphs. Your fingers are already smudged. The scribe beside you has handed you a goose feather, well part of one. The soft plumes are gone, trimmed down to a narrow, rigid shaft that's been carefully cut into a nib. You've just been introduced to the goose quill life, and what a life it is. Goose quills were the gold standard for writing implements across medieval Europe. Swans and crows made an appearance too, but goose feathers had the perfect mix of flexibility and strength. You try to write something, anything, but your line scratches like a child with a crayon and no supervision. The ink blobs. The quill snags the parchment. The monk beside you lets out a slow, pained sigh. You've committed a rookie error, not trimming the nib to the right angle. Scribes would spend ages shaping quills just so. Too wide, the ink floods. Too narrow, it won't flow. Too blunt, the line looks like you wrote it while being chased by a bear. Monastic scribes had favorite feathers the way modern people have favorite pens. They'd soak quills in water or vinegar to soften them, then cure them in hot sand or over embers to make them firmer. Some even let them sit in dung heaps for a few days to mature. Yes, dung. Warm, cozy, semi-fermented dung. For your pen. There's something strangely beautiful about how deeply they cared. You imagine a monk naming his quills, whispering encouragement like, "Come on, Beatrice, don't fail me today." As you practice your strokes, you start noticing something else, how rhythmic this life is. Dip, write, breathe, wipe, dip again. The routine pulls you in, almost meditative. But the more you write, the more you realize how much of your success depends on the ink, not just the quill. Your neighbor mutters a prayer. "The ink's too thick now." He adjusts his grip, scratches a line, shakes his head. You glance at his inkwell. It's a squat clay pot with a tightly rolled scroll of parchment beside it, an ink log. Yes, a literal log to track ink performance, how many lines per dip, how fast it dries, whether it bleeds through parchment. It's the medieval version of a lab notebook. You're starting to appreciate the nerdy, obsessive charm of it all. One mainstream fact hits you. Scribes weren't just copyists, they were highly trained technicians. Becoming one took years. You had to learn Latin, Greek sometimes, Hebrew plus illumination techniques, manuscript planning, and of course the fine art of quill maintenance. Imagine spending 7 years training for a job where spilling your ink was a career-ending disaster. And yes, it did happen. You overhear a muttered story about Brother Matthias, who once tripped while carrying a fresh pot of iron gall ink. It spilled over a half-finished psalter. That's 60 pages of ruined calfskin parchment. There was fasting, possibly weeping. Rumor says he volunteered for garden duty after that and never wrote again. You're now trying to copy a single sentence, Gloria, in Excelsis Deo. It should be elegant. Yours looks like a spider skidded across the page. The monk pats your shoulder with saintly pity. "You're not the worst I've seen," he lies kindly. Suddenly the room breaks into hushed murmurs. A new recipe is being tested. Someone no one says who has been working on an alternative to iron gall. It's a blend involving lampblack soot and egg yolk. You watch as a monk dips into the mix, writes a line, and waits. Nothing, still wet. They blow on it gently, still wet. Another monk tries it on scrap parchment. It smears. A third frowns. It's more paint than ink. You lean in. It smells weirdly pleasant. Smoky, but with a creamy edge. A bit like burnt toast and breakfast. You hear someone joke, "We should write with honey next. Then at least when it fails, we can eat the manuscript." You laugh softly. It's a sleep-deprived kind of humor. The kind that only exists when you've been hunched over a desk for hours, your fingers stained black, your vision slightly blurred. Welcome to the second-person version of Ink Monk madness. But these experiments aren't just games. They're born from a real need. Ink that dries too slowly attracts dust. Dust becomes mold. Mold eats parchment. Your life's work literally rots. On the other hand, if the ink dries too fast, it cakes the quill, making each letter a battle. Historians still argue whether scribes ever found the perfect ink. Some say there are formulas in old manuscripts that never faded. Others argue those results were accidental ingredients that fermented just right, due to climate or storage. Modern scientists have tried replicating recipes, but none have matched the richness and permanence of certain medieval inks. A soft bell chimes in the corridor. Not a fire alarm, not even a call to prayer. It's the ink break bell. Yes, that's real. The scribes stretch. You stretch too. You didn't know how stiff you'd gotten. Every joint crack sounds like a tiny protest from your spine. A monk walks past you with a tray of dried quills, laying them out like instruments in a surgeon's kit. Another monk is cleaning out an inkwell using a goose feather as a sponge. It's oddly satisfying to watch. Want to try illuminating something someone asks? You glance up. They're holding a small brush, and beside them a tiny pot of powdered gold mixed with gum. You nod. Your hand is far from steady. The line is wobbly. But there's a quiet joy in it. You're not racing toward productivity. You're not multitasking. You're doing one slow, simple, meaningful thing. A soft breeze from the tiny window rustles the edge of the parchment. The candlelight flickers again, stretching your shadow across the table. You stare at your hand, stained with black and gold, and something suspiciously green. You don't know if this ink recipe is a success, but it's strangely satisfying. You're part of something ancient, something messy, something kind of beautiful. It's bedtime history written in lowercase and ink blotches. Your back aches in that oddly satisfying way that only comes after hours of delicate focus and minor ink disasters. You rotate your shoulders, roll your wrists, and accidentally smudge a letter. The monk beside you tuts gently. You press too hard, he says. Let the ink do the work. Easy for him to say his lines look like divine whispers, and yours still resemble startled chicken footprints. But you're improving. You figured out the rhythm, how to dip just enough, how to tilt the quill for smoother strokes, how not to sneeze mid-sentence. What you're not prepared for, though, is the attitude. You've barely sat down when two monks across the scriptorium break into a whispered argument. Not about theology. Not about Latin grammar. About ink. Again. One of them insists that iron gall ink is too acidic. It eats the parchment, he says. The other scoffs, better than carbon ink, which smears at the whisper of a breeze. Their tones are hushed, but their glares could set a page on fire. You realize ink wasn't just ink. It was ideological. In medieval Europe, the two big camps were carbon ink versus iron gall ink. Carbon ink, used for centuries before, was basically soot mixed with a binder like gum arabic. Simple, smooth, and incredibly black. But it sat on the parchment instead of sinking into it, which meant it could flake off or smudge with time. Worse, one sweaty palm, and your life's work melted like snow on a skillet. Iron gall ink, by contrast, chemically bonded with parchment. It was made by combining tannic acid from oak galls with iron salts, forming a rich, penetrating black that darkened over time. Monks loved that permanence, but it came with risks. Too acidic, and it literally ate through the page. The term for this ink corrosion. It's a thing. Some scribes doubled down, and even made extra acidic recipes thinking it would last longer. These pages now look like a sad Swiss cheese hole's tears and ghostly outlines of what used to be there. You lean over and whisper, "Can't you just, dilute the ink a bit?" The monk looks horrified. Diluted ink is weak-minded ink. Right. Sorry. The ink wars weren't just about durability, though. They were about identity. Carbon ink had roots in classical antiquity, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. It was old school. Using it could be seen as conservative. Iron gall, on the other hand, was modern, practical, monastic. You weren't just writing with ink. You were picking a side in a centuries-long passive-aggressive feud. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were exaggerated, or if there really were camps of scribes who refused to even touch the wrong ink. Some suggest monasteries passed down recipes like secret family traditions, guarded, tweaked, whispered from master to apprentice like magical spells. And sometimes things got spicy. You listen as Brother Lucien recounts how one monastery in southern France refused to allow any manuscript into their library if it wasn't written with their own ink blend. Another monk adds, There's a rumor they once excommunicated a visiting scribe who brought carbon ink in his satchel. He's probably kidding. Probably. A new arrival enters the room. A traveling scribe from the North Germany, maybe. He bows, presents a roll of parchment, and more controversially, a small vial of jet black ink. The local monks immediately circle, peering into it like it might explode. One dips a quill, tests it. "Oh," he murmurs, "that's very smooth." You sense tension. This is how revolutions start in tiny inky moments. The visitor explains his blend, a mix of iron gall and carbon. The hybrid ink. Scandalous. You watch the older monks shift uncomfortably. It's like someone brought oat milk to a monastery that's been milking goats for 300 years. You test it yourself. The quill glides. The line is dark, rich, quick to dry. Your eyebrows rise. You say nothing, but a monk nearby notices. "Don't get ideas," he mutters. Back at your desk, you flip through one of the sample manuscripts. The pages vary. Some lines are faded to a dusty brown. Others have bled into the parchment, creating spidery shadows on the reverse. A few pages are just gone. Holes where ink once carved through like acid rain. You wonder what it was like for the scribes who returned to those pages after a few years watching their own work dissolve. Maybe that's why they argued. Not because they liked conflict, but because they knew how fragile everything was. That ink was memory. And that the wrong formula meant their voice wouldn't just fade, it would vanish entirely. You think about how modern life is stored on clouds and screens and servers in anonymous buildings. But these monks, they stored their knowledge in goat skin and tree tumors. Every drop of ink was a calculated risk. A soft snore breaks the tension. One of the younger scribes has dozed off mid-letter. His hand still holding the quill droops over the desk. The ink spreads slowly, silently across the page in a growing blot. A collective gasp. One of the elder monks hurries over, dabs it gently with a cloth. Too late. Someone whispers gall ink waits for no man. The snoring monk is nudged awake. He blinks, panics, then pretends nothing happened. The page is turned over. The disaster is buried like most things in the Middle Ages. A few minutes pass. The scriptorium quiets. You feel the atmosphere shifting, less tense, more sleepy. Or maybe it's just you. The flickering candles blur at the edges of your vision. You can still hear the soft scratching of quills, but it's slower now. Almost like a lullaby in ink. You try a few more strokes with the hybrid ink. Not bad, still imperfect. But your hand is steadier, your letters more confident. One monk leans in, says, "Just remember, ink is like the soul, permanent if handled with care, corrosive if abused." You nod solemnly, pretending to fully understand. Mostly you're thinking about how much your fingers smell like vinegar and tree bark. You return your quill to its stand. You watch the last few scribes rinse theirs in water bowls, blot them on soft cloth, line them up neatly for tomorrow. The argument isn't over. The debate will continue. Ink, after all, is never just about writing. It's about preservation. Legacy, ego maybe. But tonight it's also about sleep. You're still here. Still seated in that same old wooden chair, the edge of the desk digging into your forearms, and your fingers now an abstract art piece of black-brown and a curious hint of green. The air smells like the medieval version of a stationery store, if the stationery store also included mice. Yes, mice. You spot one dart across the far side of the scriptorium floor, so quick you could convince yourself it was a shadow, if not for the tiny squeak it made as it disappeared beneath the bench. The monks don't flinch. One sighs and mutters, "Not again." See, parchment may be sacred. It may be expensive. But to a mouse, it's a chew toy with historical value. They gnaw on the edges of books, nibble the bindings, even try to scurry off with small pieces of vellum. And ink, certain ingredients, especially if there's honey or wine involved, are downright appetizing. The scriptorium is a battleground not just against time and fading pigment, but against an army of tiny, squeaking archivists with no respect for scripture. You begin to understand why ink had to be more than just legible. It had to be durable, resilient, mold-resistant, rodent-discouraging if possible. Some recipes included bile, one monk tells you helpfully. Disgusts the mice. He's not joking. You look at your inkwell with new suspicion. Ink had to do a lot more than sit prettily on the page. Remember, these manuscripts weren't printed every letter line, and border was touched by human hands. That meant months of exposure to breath sweat, damp fingers, fire, smoke, oil lamps, and the ever-present threat of humidity. If your ink wasn't prepared properly, it could invite mold, the deadly kind. The kind that doesn't just smudge words, it eats them. In fact, historians still debate whether some of the damage seen in old manuscripts is more due to mold or to ink corrosion. There's no universal answer. Every monastery had different conditions: wet coastal air, dry mountain breezes, cold stone halls, and warm, cramped libraries. Each required a different ink strategy. And some scribes just weren't great at strategizing. You flip through a brittle manuscript someone left out and find pages half consumed by an ominous black bloom. It looks like smoke trapped in paper. A monk sees your expression and nods. We lost a whole gospel to that. Greedy ink, we called it. Greedy ink. That's an image you won't forget. You wonder, how did monks even preserve their work in such harsh environments? Besides tweaking their ink formulas, they employed a few clever tricks. Manuscripts were stored in cupboards lined with rosemary or bay leaves, natural deterrents to insects. In some places, they even smoked the library chambers to prevent mold from taking root. Picture a bunch of sleepy monks cold-smoking books like salmon. And then there were the margins. You probably don't think of margins as anything special, but to medieval scribes, they were lifelines. That's where errors were corrected, where bitter notes were left, where decorative borders went to shine, and crucially, where smudge tests often lived. Before copying an important passage, scribes would sometimes test their ink on the side, just a dot, a swirl, maybe the first letter of a phrase. They were testing flow, consistency, color, and yes, durability. Because if that ink bled too far into the parchment, game over. You try it yourself, one smooth letter G in the corner of your practice sheet. Looks good. Solid. You touch it gently. Still wet. You wait. You touch it again. Still wet. You blow. It smears. You sigh. The monk beside you leans over. It's the gum. Too much, I think. Ah, yes. Gum Arabic. It holds the ink together. Add too little and your ink runs wild like a toddler in a cathedral. Add too much and it turns into a sticky, globby mess that takes days to dry. Historians still argue whether late 12th century inks used more gum than earlier ones. He says, like, that's the kind of fact people just casually debate over dinner. You wonder if historians also argue about the ink-related passive aggression hidden in the margins of old manuscripts. Because yes, those existed. One famous example reads, "Whoever wrote this, may he not be cursed, but I wish he had written more clearly." Another scrawled next to a particularly faded passage, "This ink is as weak as Brother Benedict's arguments." You raise your eyebrows. The monk's still as petty as modern-day co-workers arguing over printer toner. You get back to work. This time you're copying part of a liturgical calendar, just numbers and saints' feast days. Simple, repetitive. Safe. You notice your inkwell is half empty. You glance around. No one moves to refill anything. Instead, they switch. A fresh pot is placed beside you, but its different smells sharper, like vinegar and iron. New batch, the monk explains. Slightly more iron sulfate. Might bite a little. You don't ask what bite means until later. You dip. Right. so far so good. Then after 10 or so lines, the tip of your quill starts catching tiny tears appear in the parchment. The ink is corroding, not quickly, not dramatically. But you can see the faint indentations growing deeper with each word. The monk shrugs. That one's too hungry. Ink. Hungry. You'd laugh if not for the small hole you just burned into Saint Eligius's name. You pause, breathe, listen. There's something hypnotic about the quiet in this room. The mix of focus and fatigue. The faint scratching of quills and the soft whoosh of pages turning. The candlelight flickers over rows of faces lost in lines. One monk is humming gently a hymn maybe, or just a rhythm to keep his hand steady. Another stares at a tiny droplet of ink that fell onto the margin, like it betrayed him personally. You lean back. Your work isn't perfect, but it's better than yesterday's. Maybe better than Brother Benedict's. There's peace in the monotony, a sense of timelessness. You begin to understand why scribes stayed here for decades, why they argued over ink recipes, as if eternal salvation depended on it. Because maybe for them it did. In a world where books were rare and memory-fragile ink was everything. By now your hands are permanently tinted with black-brown streaks. Your sleeves carry the musky aroma of oak galls and vinegar, and the tip of your nose itches from parchment dust. You've officially crossed into the realm of the ink-stained elite, or at least a somewhat confused apprentice with an ever-growing respect for medieval chemistry. Tonight's task, brewing your own ink. A monk beckons you toward the back of the scriptorium, where a small alcove has been transformed into what looks suspiciously like a medieval potion lab. Clay pots, wooden spoons, hanging bundles of dried herbs. There's even a smoky cauldron bubbling gently over embers, and you're not entirely sure whether you're expected to write with this stuff or defeat a dragon. The monk Brother Gerwald gestures solemnly toward an array of ingredients. We begin, he intones, with the sacred gall, oak galls. Those lumpy tumor-like growths you sometimes see clinging to oak trees like alien marbles. They're created when certain wasps inject their larvae into leaves, and the tree responds by forming this protective growth. Monks, being resourceful and slightly desperate, figured out that when you crush and soak these galls, you extract tannic acid. And tannic acid, when mixed with iron salts, creates the basis of the most enduring ink of the Middle Ages, iron gall ink. You reach for a gall, it's light, dry, woody. You crush it in a mortar with satisfying crunches, releasing a faintly sour, earthy scent. It's the smell of forgotten forests and apparently reliable documentation. Next, Brother Gerwald hands you a small pouch of vitriol, also known as ferrous sulfate. It's the iron half of the iron gall equation. A pale greenish powder that smells vaguely metallic, like rain on old coins. Careful, he says, it bites. A phrase you've come to accept as both literal and metaphorical. You combine the ingredients with water, some recipes call for vinegar, or even wine. But Gerwald says those are for monks who like drama. The mixture begins to darken instantly. The tannins react with the iron, turning it from murky brown to bluish black. The transformation is oddly satisfying, like watching alchemy happen in a wooden bowl. To thicken the mixture, you add gum arabic, a resin collected from acacia trees, often imported from North Africa. It acts as a binder, keeping the pigment suspended and preventing it from soaking too deeply into the parchment. Stir too little, and the ink separates. Stir too much, and you start to feel like you're trying to churn glue. The result, a pungent, slightly gritty fluid, with a consistency somewhere between tea and tar. You dip a test quill. The ink glides out smoothly, bold and glossy. You nod, feeling quietly triumphant. Then the line fades. Turns out iron gall ink doesn't go on black. It darkens as it dries. It's like watching a letter slowly emerge from the parchment, timid at first, then confidently asserting itself. You pause, admiring your work, when Gerwald chuckles. Now we wait 3 days and see if it turns brown. Wait 3 days. Oh yes, he says. A good ink should settle. You stirred it too fast. The wine recipe is better for speed, but, well, you want your psalms to last, don't you? This is where things get weird. Apparently there are dozens of known ink recipes from the Middle Ages, and not one of them agrees with the next. Some called for cider, others added beer, a few even recommended spit, although Gerwald grimaces at that one. Only when desperate. There's one recipe that includes crushed wasp nests, another that instructs you to let the mixture rot until the scent grows bold. Whatever that means. Historians still argue whether these recipes were truly effective or just wildly hopeful. Some seem rooted in regional quirks, coastal monasteries, favoring wine-based inks, colder regions choosing stronger iron concentrations to withstand damp. One manuscript from a Bavarian scriptorium suggests storing your ink underground with the carrots, which raises a number of questions. You ask Gerwald if there's one perfect recipe. He snorts. Perfect, he says. Ink is like monks. Some look divine. Some age badly. That seems accurate. You examine your earlier efforts and notice one of your practice pages has already started to oxidize, the once black lettering curling into a dull brown. Still legible. Still handsome in a faded sort of way. But not quite eternal. A whisper travels through the scriptorium someone's ink has exploded. You follow the murmurs to a novice hunched over a table staring in horror at a bowl of frothy purplish liquid. It fizzes. It hisses. It smells like sulfur and regret. Too much iron, someone mutters. Another adds, or too much ego. You step away. That's when it hits you. Scribes weren't just writers. They were chemists, chefs, sometimes accidental pyrotechnicians. Their work required patience, precision, and a disturbing comfort with boiling, strange, organic matter. Some monks guarded their recipes fiercely. One famous English scribe left behind a manuscript that read, "This ink is mine. Use it, and the wrath of Saint Jerome be upon you." That's dramatic, but understandable. When your entire life's labor could be undone by a bad batch of ink, you'd get a little territorial too. Your hands are sticky with gum residue. The sleeves of your robe now have permanent black smears. You lean back and take it all in, the bubbling pots, the flickering candles, the smell of vinegar and smoke, the soft murmurs of scribes discussing ratios and reactivity like it's life or death. Because in a way it was. Ink was memory, law, scripture, identity. Without it, there was nothing. You set your batch to cool. Cover it gently with linen. You may have added too much gum, or too little. The iron might be a touch aggressive, or it might fade beautifully like some of the oldest manuscripts we still admire today. Time will tell, and in the world of medieval scribes, time is the most important ingredient of all. You're back at your desk. The ink you made earlier is resting in its little clay pot covered with a square of linen and looking oddly smug, like it knows something you don't. Probably because it does. You stare at a pristine sheet of parchment. Crisp. Smooth. Just waiting to become a page of something meaningful, something eternal. You dip your quill into your new brew, carefully scrape off the excess, and start writing the first word of a psalm. And then, it happens. A single traitorous drop of ink falls from the quill's nib plop right onto the page. Right in the middle. A dark, wet, spreading blotch. You blink. The ink seeps outward, soaking into the parchment's fibers like blood into cloth. You blot it with a scrap of wool too late. The damage is done. The word domine now has a black eye the size of a small kingdom. You sit in stunned silence. Across the room, a monk sees the look on your face and smiles knowingly. "First ink blot," he asks. You nod. He points to the ceiling. See that one, you follow his finger. A dark brown spot is faintly visible in the corner beam. Brother Gaspar threw his psalter at the rafters. Missed the abbot by this much. He holds his fingers an inch apart. Over an ink blot. It's not just you. Ink blots were a constant fear in the scriptorium. No backspace. No whiteout. Just months of work wrecked by one drop. That's why scribes developed incredibly specific techniques to avoid them. Always hold the quill at a 45-degree angle. Flick the nib before dipping again. Rotate your inkwell lid when you exhale. Yes, really. You glance around and see an older monk gently dragging a curved knife over a smudged line. This is a penknife, and no, it wasn't just for sharpening quills. It was also used to scrape away ink from the surface of the parchment. Done carefully, the scribe could remove a mistake and rewrite over it. Done poorly, you ended up with a hole, a page with more than 2 scrapes. Highly suspicious. Some abbots would reject it outright. After all, who wants a gospel full of paper wounds? Historians still argue whether these corrections were seen as acceptable craftsmanship or shameful errors. Some manuscripts show signs of deliberate patchwork, while others look as though the scribe just gave up and wrote sorry in the margins. Some scribes dealt with mistakes by working around them, turning a blot into part of a decorative border, or even integrating it into an illustrated capital. You spot one clever example in a nearby manuscript. A dark smear has been transformed into the shadow of a dragon curled beneath a saint's foot. That's one way to redeem your ink disaster. Still, most monks didn't take blots lightly. There are margin notes hundreds of years old that say things like, "I have ruined this page. Lord, forgive my ink." Or, "This page blotted because Brother Petros startled me with his coughing." Petros apparently was not popular. You look back at your own mistake. It's there, big and obvious and inky. But it's not the end of the world. You decide to scrape it. You take the knife. Carefully, you begin to lift the top layer of the parchment. It curls slightly under the blade. The ink comes up with it. Not perfect, not clean, but better. You smooth the surface with your fingertip. The texture's different, but passable. You exhale. A monk offers a small piece of powdered pumice stone. To buff it, he explains. Give the new ink something to cling to. You rub it gently over the scraped area. It works. You rewrite the word slower this time. No blot. You glance up triumphant, and then your quill spits another droplet 2 lines down. Of course it does. You give a defeated smile and look around. Turns out you're not alone. Across the room, someone's trying to blow dry their manuscript over a candle. Another is glaring at their page like it personally insulted their entire ancestry. One younger scribe, red-faced and furious, has simply drawn a cartoon of a demon next to his mistake with the caption, "Tempted me to sneeze." Ink blots weren't just annoyances, they were part of the scribal experience. In a world that demanded perfection but offered little forgiveness, every blot was a tiny existential crisis. And yet these monks kept going, page after page, blot after blot. You remember what Brother Gerwald said earlier, ink is like monks. Some age beautifully, some burn holes. Speaking of which, the scribe across from you gasps. He's been using a more acidic recipe trying to get a darker tone. It worked beautifully, dark ink. But now under the flicker of candlelight, you see tiny pinholes forming in his letters. The iron gall is too strong. It's eating the parchment alive. We warned him, someone says not unkindly. You look closer and notice the faint shimmer of crystals forming along the strokes. Iron salts, when over-concentrated, can crystallize on the page. They glisten like frost, beautiful but deadly. Manuscripts with high acidity don't just rot, they shatter. Pages crack, split, and crumble over time. Some of the most ornate texts in European history have had to be reconserved, stored in dark vaults, and read only by robots to avoid turning them into dust. You watch the monk gently press a cloth over his page, not to erase the mistake, just to stop it from spreading. Sometimes that's all you can do. The scriptorium grows quieter. It's getting late. The candles are lower. The scratching of quills slows to the pace of breathing. You return to your blot. You write around it, carefully, forgivingly, because in the end, ink is unpredictable. It drips, it stains, it fades, but it also preserves, endures, and tells stories centuries later, just like the monks who wielded it. You wake yourself with a quiet snort, startled by how far your chin had sunk into your chest. There's a soft, damp patch on your robe, where a little line of drool had begun its descent, perfectly medieval. Around you, the scriptorium continues its quiet symphony of scratches and sighs. No one noticed your brief doze. Or if they did, they were polite enough to pretend. Back to work. Tonight the lesson isn't about ink. It's about the parchment. See, without parchment, there's no point arguing over ink recipes. You can't write on dreams, although if monks could have, they would have tried. You run your hand across the fresh sheet in front of you. It's soft, but firm, faintly yellowed, and smells vaguely like old leather and time. Which makes sense because parchment is leather. Usually calfskin, though sheepskin and goatskin were used too. Vellum, the luxury version, came from the skin of unborn calves. Yes, unborn. You pause at that. A little grim maybe, but this was the Middle Ages, where bookmaking was 1 part worship, 2 parts sacrifice. To make parchment, the monks first soaked the hides in a lye solution, basically old urine and ashes to loosen the hair. Then they scraped it clean with curved blades, stretched it tightly on a wooden frame, and let it dry under tension. Every so often, someone would walk by and re-scrape smooth or rub in chalk to whiten the surface. Think of it like medieval exfoliation, but for dead animals. The result? A writing surface that could last 1,000 years if you didn't ruin it with terrible ink. Or mice. You look at your current sheet. There's a faint scar down the left margin, probably from a stubborn goat. You can almost hear its ghostly meh echo through the parchment. Each sheet was unique. No two exactly alike. Some pages had faint freckles ridges, or even visible hair follicles. Monks learned to write around these imperfections. Sometimes they embraced them, turning a hole into a halo, a scar into a vine. You trace your finger along the parchment's edge, noticing the subtle difference between the hair side and the flesh side. The hair side is slightly rougher, more textured. That side took ink differently sometimes, unpredictably. That's why some manuscripts change character between pages. It's not always the scribe's fault. Sometimes it's the cow's fault, or the sheep's, or the unborn calf's. Medieval bookmaking was a team effort, even if the team didn't know they'd been recruited. You dip your quill. The ink flows nicely today. Your brew from the other night has mellowed. It's a rich brown now, with just the tiniest violet hue. You've named it Saint Blotto. It seems fitting. You begin copying a short prayer. The letters curl into place, clean and sharp. You're in the zone. The scratch of your quill matches the rhythm of your breath. You almost feel peaceful. Then your nib catches a rough patch. The quill jerks. The letter E turns into something no language has yet invented. You mutter something mildly inappropriate. A nearby monk raises an eyebrow. You reach for your penknife. This happens often. Parchment, despite its durability, is unpredictable. Stretch marks, thin spots, hidden grease. If a scribe didn't clean the surface properly, or if the animal had particularly oily skin, the ink would just bead up or skate across the surface like a toddler on ice. You scrape, carefully. The mark fades. You rub in a little chalk, smooth it with your sleeve, and try again. This time it sticks. You ask the monk beside you how many sheets a standard gospel would require. He thinks for a moment. About 250. Double that if you count both sides. That's 500 pages. Each page made by hand. Each sheet scraped, cleaned, stretched, and dried over weeks. Then trimmed, lined with a stylus, illuminated sometimes, bound with thread, covered in wooden boards and wrapped in leather. All for one book. And how many animals does it take to make a 500-page manuscript? 60, the monk says. Maybe more if the goats were small. 60 goats. You glance down at your modest little sheet. It represents weeks of labor, a significant portion of someone's herd. Probably prayers, too. No pressure. You get back to your sentence. The ink's behaving. Your quill, now trimmed to a fine point, flows smoothly. You're starting to understand the tactile rhythm of the job, how your wrist needs to hover, not rest. How pressure shifts the line weight. How a sigh too close to the page can ripple a letter's edge. Scribes were athletes of stillness. You wonder, did they enjoy this? Did they love it? Or was it just penance? Historians still argue whether most monks saw scribing as divine duty or relentless toil. Some loved it, the silence, the purpose, the craft. Others left behind little angry notes in the margins like, "Thank God I am done with this book." Relatable. Your current line finishes with a flourish. You sit back. There's a small ink dot on your thumb. You wipe it on your robe. The robe is already a canvas of accidents. The candles burn low now. One scribe gently replaces the wicks. Another stokes the brazier with practiced ease. The scriptorium smells of wax, parchment, and patience. You glance down at your page. A full paragraph. Only 2 corrections. Not bad. You notice a small note written in faded red ink at the bottom corner of your parchment, probably from a previous draft. It reads, "God sees the work even when it smudges." You smile at that, because in the end, parchment may be a luxury ink, may be temperamental, and scribes may argue endlessly over gall strength, but the goal was always the same: to preserve meaning, to hold on to thought, to write it down and send it across time. You dip your quill again. You shift slightly on the bench, which creaks its disapproval, as if warning you not to get too comfortable. Your legs tingle from sitting cross-legged too long, and your lower back hums with the familiar ache that only comes from spending hours bent like a question mark over a desk. But still you write. The scriptorium hums quietly around you. In a space like this, time moves differently. Not faster, not slower, just thicker. Like you're swimming through the day rather than walking through it. Today's task: rubrics. Not the modern grading guidelines you know today, but the medieval origin instructions written in red ink. The word rubric comes from the Latin rubrica, meaning red ochre. Monks used this special ink to highlight important passages, headings, and directions in a manuscript. It wasn't decorative, it was functional. A kind of medieval highlighter if your highlighter took 3 hours to make and could ruin your reputation if applied badly. Brother Matthias hands you a tiny jar. Inside, deep, earthy crimson. It shimmers slightly in the candlelight. You tilt it. It's thicker than the black ink, more paste than liquid. The color comes from natural pigments, red, lead, vermilion, or sometimes cinnabar. All of which, by the way, are very toxic. You glance at the label scratched into the side, rubrica, "Do not inhale." Good advice. You dip a special quill into the red and begin your rubrication, adding a chapter heading to the top of the page. The ink spreads differently, slightly stickier than your iron gall blend. It takes longer to dry, and if you blow on it, it smells faintly metallic and suspiciously like something you shouldn't be breathing. One of the monks coughs dramatically from across the room. "That's the cinnabar batch," he says, voice muffled behind a sleeve. "We lost a brother to that once." You're not sure if he's joking, maybe half joking. Historians still argue whether the toxicity of medieval red pigments was widely understood or blissfully ignored. Some sources suggest scribes developed headaches, shakes, and even chronic illness from prolonged exposure. Others claim the quantities were so small, the danger was minimal, unless of course you had a habit of licking your quill, which apparently many did. The rule never taste the rubrics. Red ink wasn't just for headings. It also marked liturgical instructions, feast days, and occasionally corrections. In illuminated manuscripts, it often served as the base layer beneath gold leaf, helping the gilding pop. And oh, the gold. You glance over at a nearby monk bent carefully over a psalter. He's applying gold leaf to the capital letter Q. It glows under his lamplight like a sunrise pressed flat. He dabs the spot with a sticky mixture called gesso made from plaster fish glue and sometimes garlic juice. Because medieval monks were both artists and vampires, apparently. The gold leaf is thinner than breath. It floats like a whisper. The monk uses a small brush made from squirrel tail hairs to nudge it into place. Then, with a soft breath, he gently presses it down. It gleams. Illumination wasn't required for most texts. It was expensive, slow, and frankly a bit ridiculous. But for sacred books, royal commissions, or wealthy patrons, it was a must. And for the scribe, it was a chance to elevate their work into the realm of the divine. You look back at your rubric. It's still drying. You hope it doesn't smudge. The next page you're assigned is trickier. It's a calendar page. These were filled with saints' feast days, astronomical symbols, and Latin abbreviations so complex they made even the monks squint. You're told to rubricate all the major holidays. One monk leans over and helpfully adds, "Also mark St. Foylin's Day." That's the abbot's favorite. You look it up. St. Foylan, 7th century Irish missionary martyred in Belgium. Also known for baking. The entry isn't clear. Either way, you add it in red. Carefully. You're starting to appreciate the psychology of rubrication. There's something comforting about marking what's important, about giving structure to the otherwise endless march of text. The red ink acts like a pause, a guidepost, a gentle nudge that says, "Hey, this part matters." And sometimes, it was used passive-aggressively. You stumble upon a side project another monk is working on. It's a commentary on a heretical text. Every time the original author makes a theological mistake, the scribe underlines it in red and adds a very dramatic note in the margin. Foolishness written in crimson that none may be deceived. Ouch. You ask him if that's common. He nods. Rubrics reveal the soul of the scribe. He grins, and occasionally his lack of patience. You finish your current page and blow gently on the red headings. They shimmer like tiny embers. You set the sheet aside and look at your fingers, now stained pinkish orange. You'll carry that color for days. Across the scriptorium, a new sheet is pinned to the wall. A fresh rubric sample, new format, new calligraphic style. It's a note from the abbot: all psalms will henceforth use double capitals in rubrics. Adjust accordingly. The monks groan collectively. One mutters, another change. Another says he's been reading the Cluny Codex again. Someone else adds, it's the red ink talking. Because even in the quietest rooms, there's always change. Rubrics, despite their formality, were fluid. Different monasteries followed different rules. Some used red ink generously. Others reserved it for only the holiest moments. Some scribes rebelled entirely and used blue-green, even purple. Historians still debate whether the colors were based on tradition, personality, or pigment availability. Probably all three. Your current manuscript now has neat red titles, an illuminated B, and 2 minor smudges you managed to disguise as decorative flourishes. Not bad for one night's work. You stretch. The red ink glistens. You've learned something important. Tonight, writing may preserve knowledge, but color gives it meaning. A new day, another sheet, and another strange task from the abbot's ever-growing list of scriptorium refinements. Today, you've been assigned to help create the decorative capitals, those oversized embellished letters at the start of a paragraph that often look like they've been possessed by a particularly festive vine. Capital letters were never just about readability. In the medieval scriptorium, they were opportunities to show off, to imbue sacred texts with beauty, and to sneak in the occasional whimsical cat if you were feeling brave. The monk training you today is Brother Theobald, a wiry figure with ink permanently crusted under his nails and the quiet intensity of someone who has stared at too many spirals for too long. He hands you a practice sheet and murmurs, "We begin with the D. Always start with the D. It's the easiest to turn into a dragon." That raises questions. You glance at the examples hanging around the scriptorium-framed practice sheets pinned to the walls like gallery exhibits. Giant illuminated letters filled with curling vines, peeking monks, yawning lions, angels holding scrolls, and yes, several dragons. Some letters are grandiose, others mischievous. One E contains what appears to be a monk kicking a demon down a flight of stairs. Another Q contains a cat playing a lute. It's unclear whether this was liturgical or simply boredom. You take a deep breath and start sketching. Your quill moves slower for this kind of work strokes, deliberate curves exaggerated. You're not just writing a letter. You're telling a tiny story. Theobald watches closely. "More weight in the downstroke," he says. "And don't fear the flourish." Your D starts to resemble, well, not quite a dragon, but perhaps a snake who's considering a career change. He nods approvingly anyway. Decorated initials were more than vanity. They served practical purposes, helping readers navigate dense manuscripts before the invention of paragraph breaks or page numbers. A large ornate P meant, "Here begins something new. Pay attention." And the styles were regional. English monasteries loved geometric interlacing patterns. Think Celtic knots trapped inside the letter G. French scribes were more organic, all vines and leaves and floating angels. German scripts, dense, dark, and just a little intimidating. You're told one German psalter had a capital S that took up an entire page and featured 34 different birds, none of which actually lived in Europe. Historians still argue whether certain decorative styles indicated specific monastic orders, or if scribes simply copied what they saw and added their own flair. After all, these letters were equal parts function and personality. A bored monk with extra time might hide jokes in the margins, faces in leaves, animals with human expressions, and more than a few illustrations of other monks asleep at their desks. You try your hand at an R. The loop goes well, but the foot gets a little squiggly. You try to fix it, and now it looks like the letter is tripping over itself. "Make it dance," Theobald advises. You smile. That's exactly what these letters do. They dance, swirl, leap off the page. And within them you glimpse the inner life of the scribe, their skill, their mood, maybe even their sleep deprivation. The most famous decorated capitals often included gold leaf. You've already seen that delicate process up close. But even without gilding, the use of vivid pigments, red, blue, green, even rare ultramarine made from crushed lapis lazuli, elevated the letters into mini masterpieces. Tonight, however, you're working with a more humble palette. A soft ochre, a faded blue made from ground woad, and a bit of walnut brown. Earthy, modest, still lovely. Theobald shows you how to layer color, first outline the letter, then fill the base tone, and finally add tiny highlights to suggest depth. A good capital, he says, should invite the reader in. And some did more than invite. They startled, seduced, even joked. You're shown one manuscript from the 13th century that features a decorative A where two rabbits are chasing a snail who is inexplicably carrying a sword. No one knows why. Theories range from a political allegory to, quote, Brother Arnold had too much wine. Well, that's the thing about these letters. They were allowed to be weird. They offered a little breathing room in a sea of solemnity, a place for humor, imagination, and rebellion. You attempt another D this time, adding a vine that curls outward and forms a tiny sleeping face in the center. It's subtle, but it's there. Theobald sees it and says nothing, just nods. You wonder if he has a gallery of secret jokes buried in his own manuscripts. Probably. The older monks get that glint in their eyes when discussing marginalia. A glint that says, I once drew a cow juggling rosaries in the Book of Revelation, and no one caught it. Decorative letters weren't just a flourish. They were invitations to linger, to pause, to see the divine in the details, and to remember that even in an age of suffering, labor, and devotion, there was room for beauty, for joy, for absurdity. You think about that as you finish your last D of the evening. The dragon now looks more like a sleepy lizard with a mustache, but you're proud of it. You set the page aside and stretch your fingers. The scriptorium is quieter now. Quills have gone still. A monk gently snores in the far corner. The candles flicker low, casting long shadows that dance over the rows of parchment. You watch the shadows and imagine them shaped like your letters, twisting, alive. Decorated capitals, after all, are like whispered stories at the edge of Scripture. They wink at you across centuries. They say, someone made this. Someone laughed. Someone cared. You blow out your candle. The ink dries slowly in the dark. Your candle guttered out an hour ago, and now the only light comes from a low oil lamp kept alive by a fellow scribe too stubborn or too caffeinated on barley brew to sleep. Your fingers ache. Your eyes feel like they've been dusted with chalk. And yet you keep writing. Because tonight is indexing night. You hadn't realized that someone had to make indexes in the medieval world. Like most things in history, it didn't just magically appear. Somewhere, someone sat hunched at a desk, flipping through pages and deciding which words mattered enough to be listed at the back or front of a book. Tonight, that someone is you. The manuscript you've been assigned is a collection of sermons. Not your most thrilling read. No dragons, no sleepy cats. Just dense blocks of Latin theology and the occasional strongly worded condemnation of dancing. The monk overseeing the process is Brother Marinus, who hasn't blinked in 17 minutes. He lays out the system, mark significant terms, sin, grace, fasting, etc., and note the corresponding page or folio. Do this with extreme care. Do not make assumptions about what's important. And under no circumstances should you include your own opinions. You nod obediently and immediately think, I will definitely include my own opinions. You begin flipping through the manuscript, gently thumbing each page. It's surprisingly sturdy, the parchment curling only slightly at the edges. Most pages are numbered in Roman numerals at the top, sometimes written in rubric, sometimes just scratched faintly in pencil. You spot the word temptation for the 5th time and consider whether it's worth marking. You glance at Marinus. He's still staring at his page like it owes him money. Yes, temptation gets a mark. This, you realize, is where the real mental gymnastics of monastic life come in. Creating the index isn't just clerical, it's philosophical. You have to decide what counts as worthy of reference. Some words appear often but don't mean much. Others, like mercy or dust, appear only once, but seem to carry a kind of divine gravity. You start to appreciate the weird weight of this job. Indexing isn't glamorous. It's not illuminated. It's not gilded. It's invisible unless done badly. But without it, finding anything in a 400-page volume is like trying to locate a sneeze in the wind. You flip to a sermon about gluttony. The author, possibly a hungry monk himself, goes into excruciating detail about the perils of figs, warm bread, and wine-soaked pears. You pause and mark gluttony, bread, and wine pears. Because let's be honest, someone will want to revisit that passage. You start forming a rhythm. Read, identify, annotate, flip. Your margin notes are small, tidy, and surprisingly satisfying. You feel for the first time in hours like you're solving a puzzle, like you're leaving breadcrumbs through the forest of words. Marinus wanders over, glancing at your progress. He nods, then frowns. You marked sleep. You shrug. It's mentioned 7 times. Once as a virtue. He stares at you. That was metaphorical sleep, as in spiritual neglect. Still, you say, feels relevant? He doesn't argue, just mutters something about loose standards and walks off. Historians still argue whether medieval indexes were made to guide deep study or simply as tools for harried monks preparing sermons on tight deadlines. Some scholars claim early indexes were laughably inconsistent. Others praise them as the first signs of organized information retrieval in Western thought. You suspect it was both. You flip to a page that includes an obscure reference to weeping stones. That's too good to ignore. You write it in the margins and add it to your growing list. Weeping stones might not be a major theological concept, but if you were bored in church and flipping through a sermon book, wouldn't you want to find the page about crying rocks? By now you've marked over 100 keywords. Your system is starting to grow branches, cross-references, sub-entries. You add penance, and then under it, public, private, and imaginary, because apparently one sermon discusses imaginary sins, which sounds like a bedtime argument waiting to happen. The manuscript has no table of contents, no chapter breaks. Your indexing feels less like list-making and more like cartography. You're drawing a mental map of ideas, sketching out the contours of moral geography. At one point, you realize someone else has annotated this text before you. Faintly in the upper right corner of one page, there's a smudged word, skip. You smile. Some things never change. You consider slipping in your own editorial notes. Just once. Something harmless like, see also despair, but only if you must. But you resist, mostly. You begin assembling the actual index. Each entry is written on a separate scrap of parchment, to be later arranged and recopied. It feels like assembling a deck of cards. You begin to organize them alphabetically. Kind of. Medieval alphabetization was often more vibe-based than strict order. You arrange your notes: abstinence, angels, bread soft, bread hard, cats metaphorical, dust, fasting, fig envy, mercy, weeping stones. Is it the most scholarly index? Maybe not. Is it deeply useful? Arguably, yes. Indexing makes you realize how arbitrary memory can be. What do we preserve? What do we highlight? What slips through the cracks of parchment and ink? You place the final slips in order, ready for review. Marinus walks by, eyes them, and mutters, "Not terrible," which from him is high praise. You feel a flicker of pride. This index won't be illuminated. No one will gold leaf your keywords. But centuries from now, a monk or maybe even a sleepy YouTube viewer might stumble across a passage about wine pairs or cats or spiritual naps and wonder who marked it. It was you, and for a moment, that's enough. It's late. The kind of late where the oil in the lamps is just a memory and the darkness clings to the corners like thick wool. But your eyes have adjusted. Your fingers move on their own now muscle memory, guiding them across the page. The quill glides. The ink flows. The hours slip away like sand in a cracked hourglass. Tonight the task shifts again, marginalia. Not in the modern sense of footnotes or formal comments. No, this is medieval marginalia, that strange and wonderful art of doodling on sacred texts. You've seen it before. Everyone in the scriptorium has. Some monks think of it as blasphemous. Others can't stop doing it. The abbot's latest instruction is clear: any damaged or awkward space in the margins should be filled with minor decoration. Just enough to balance the page. But no monkeys with bagpipes this time, he warns, looking directly at Brother Sebald. You suppress a grin. You've seen Sebald's musical monkeys. They were disturbingly detailed. One of them might have been playing a lute with its tail. Tonight, you're assigned a psalter with several blank gaps places where the text ends early on the page. These were visual potholes, opportunities for chaos or beauty depending on the monk's mood. You begin by outlining a small vine pattern, harmless, traditional. It winds delicately up the side of the margin. But then, your quill hesitates. The curve of the vine sort of looks like a gooseneck, with a little curve here and a dab there. Suddenly there's a goose wearing a bishop's hat. You pause. You probably shouldn't, but you do. Marginalia was never truly sanctioned, but it flourished anyway. Scribes used it to break monotony, to comment on the text, to vent frustrations, or just to entertain. Sometimes it was reverent, sometimes absurd, sometimes downright cryptic. You flip through older manuscripts and spot a knight fighting a giant snail, a nun chasing a rabbit with a sword, a man inside a fish reading a book, possibly Jonah, possibly not. A literal marginal note, I am so cold I could write no more. Historians still argue whether these illustrations were meant as coded commentary, visual allegory, or just the medieval equivalent of drawing mustaches on magazine covers. One theory claims snails represented sin always creeping back in. Another suggests monks just found snails funny. Hard to blame them. You add a small owl in the lower corner, half hidden in the vines. It watches the page like a sleepy sentinel. Marginalia wasn't just for animals or jokes. Sometimes it was corrective. A scribe might spot an error in the text and draw a tiny pointing hand called a manicule to direct the reader to the correction. You draw one now, a chubby little fist with an outstretched finger clearly fed on too much barley bread. You add a Latin word above it, vide look, and there it is, a functional doodle. You've officially contributed to the strange sideways history of bookmaking. Your neighbor is less subtle. He's doodling a cat chasing a fish across 3 pages of the canticles. The fish is winning. You admire his commitment to narrative. Another monk adds a mini portrait of himself, yawning into the margin of a particularly dense homily. Beneath it, he writes, "I am here, still copying." Some scribes added actual jokes. In one manuscript beside a passage on humility, a note reads, "Brother Ambrose says he's the humblest, which I think defeats the point." You ask your neighbor, "Is this allowed?" He shrugs. Technically no, realistically depends who finds it. Monks were human, and humanity tends to spill out sideways, especially when copying the same passage about divine wrath for the 12th time in a row. You return to your page. There's a wide margin near the bottom that practically begs for something. You hesitate, then sketch a sleeping monk under a tree. Next to him, a small devil trying to wake him with a trumpet. The monk is holding a pillow labeled faith. You might be getting carried away, but honestly, that's how half the best marginalia happened. Once you start, it's hard to stop. You think about the tension between sacred labor and personal rebellion, between permanence and play. These manuscripts were meant to last centuries, to carry the word of God across generations. And yet here you are adding a cartoon mouse dangling from a vine. Is it disrespect, or is it reverence through levity? Historians don't agree. Some believe the scribes saw their marginalia as deeply meaningful. Others think it was pure escapism. Still others believe these little figures had to be added to keep the eye moving, to break up the monotony, to keep the reader awake. You suspect it's all true, because marginalia tells us that even in places of silence and discipline, people needed to laugh, needed to doodle, needed to create without consequence. You stand stretching your legs. Your feet have gone numb. The cold stone beneath your sandals reminds you just how long you've been sitting. You look back at your page. It's full now. The text is crisp. The rubric headings clear. The margins alive. A goose bishop, a judgmental owl, a sleepy monk with a trumpet-wielding devil. They stare up at you like old friends. Tomorrow, someone will review the manuscript. Maybe they'll scowl. Maybe they'll chuckle. Maybe they'll miss it entirely. But you'll know. You added a little breath to the border of history, and that's something. You've survived your share of odd assignments in the scriptorium, ink-brewing misadventures, goatskin disasters, red ink poisoning threats, and yes, the occasional trumpet-wielding devil in the margins. But today, you've been asked to tackle something truly daunting, the colophon. It doesn't sound particularly dramatic. It's not gilded or decorated or even meant to be read aloud. But in the world of manuscript making, the colophon is the last word. Literally. A colophon is a short inscription placed at the end of a manuscript, usually written by the scribe. Think of it like the medieval equivalent of rolling credits. And if done right, it could be funny, moving, poetic, or passive-aggressively bitter. Your mentor today is Brother Anselm, who's responsible for checking each manuscript's final page. He has the dry demeanor of someone who has read too many colophons and has very little patience for the overdramatic ones. The colophon, he says, holding up a sheet as if it were a dying flower, is not your personal diary. It is not a confession booth. And for the love of Saint Jerome, it is not a space for jokes about cheese. You try not to look guilty. You'd absolutely plan to make a cheese joke. He continues, "It is your quiet signature, your invisible bow." You nod solemnly, and then immediately start composing one in your head. Traditionally, colophons could include the name of the scribe, first name, only modesty, and all that. The date the manuscript was completed. A short prayer for the scribe's soul. And occasionally, a cry for help. You're shown a few famous examples from the Abbey's archives. "I wrote this while the snow fell thick as wool. My ink froze, my fingers cracked. Pray for me." The end. Thank God. If I ever copy this again, I shall surely perish. Whoever defaces this book will be eaten by swine in hell. One simply reads, "I am so tired." You feel a deep kinship with that one. Historians still argue whether colophons were sincere expressions of exhaustion, clever literary traditions, or part of a scribal rite of passage. Most agree they served a dual purpose, marking the end of labor, and gently reminding future readers that behind every elegant manuscript was a weary human being with cramped hands and fading eyesight. You pick up your quill and stare at the blank space beneath your final copied line. This is it, the last bit. The finishing touch only, without the sparkle and glamour. No dragons, no gold, just you. You begin slowly, finished by the hand of a humble scribe beneath the west-facing window on the 3rd day of March in the year of our Lord, 1272. It's safe, standard, boring. Then you pause. You add, "The ink ran low." My patience lower still. But the Lord sustained me, as did the goat cheese brother Peter snuck into the scriptorium. A little joke, just subtle enough to pass. You hope. You add one more line softer this time. "If you read these words, remember the hand that wrote them. May they lead you to light." You sign with your initials because even humble scribes have egos, and set down your quill. The act feels strangely emotional. Not because of the words, but because it marks something finished. You've spent weeks, or has it been months, living with this manuscript. Its smudges, its mistakes, its margins filled with half-lucid animals and speculative saints. And now it's done. Colophons, you realize, aren't just for the reader. They're for the scribe. The full stop at the end of a long, ink-stained sentence. Brother Anselm reads your colophon. He says nothing for a while, then simply mutters, "Acceptable," which from him is basically a standing ovation. You notice other scribes finishing their own texts. One kisses his manuscript gently before rolling it for binding. Another murmurs a short prayer. A third just flops backward and groans like a wounded ox. The atmosphere changes when a colophon is written. there's a sense of closure, relief, melancholy. Like parting from a friend who drove you mad, but whom you'll miss all the same. You help carry your finished manuscript to the shelving room, a dim, cool place lined with wooden cabinets. Some books here are centuries old. Others still smell faintly of fresh ink and sheep. You place your volume between two others and pause. It doesn't look like much. No glowing cover, no sparkling clasps. But inside, hours of labor, drops of sweat, occasional tears, and one goat in a bishop's hat. You realize now why some colophons read like eulogies. Because these books aren't just vessels of knowledge. They're little tombs of time. They trap 1,000 quiet moments inside parchment and ink. Every blot, every correction, every marginal owl, it's all still there. Still alive. You linger a moment longer, then turn to leave. On the way out, you pass an older manuscript, one from decades ago. Its colophon is short. A single sentence. God knows when I began this, and only He knows when I finished it. You chuckle. Sounds about right. You didn't think it could get more tedious than copying endless sermons or more mysterious than goose-headed bishops in the margins. But today's assignment proves you wrong. You've been chosen to work on a palimpsest. The word alone sounds fancy, maybe even mystical. But once Brother Gervais hands it to you, you realize it's just weird. A strange yellowish sheet of parchment with ghost letters bleeding through the surface. It's as if someone tried to erase history and did a spectacularly average job. Palimpsests were medieval recycling projects. When parchment was scarce or expensive, or your manuscript was really bad, monks would scrape off the old writing and reuse the same sheet to write something new. It's like editing a Word document with a chisel. This sheet, according to Gervais, has already had at least 2 previous lives. You can just make out some older, faded writing beneath the newer black ink, a faint reddish scrawl that runs perpendicular to the main text. You'll be transcribing both, Gervais says, handing you a magnifying glass and a look of pure apology. It's dizzying. Your task is to read the main text, a perfectly boring commentary on St. Basil's dietary guidelines, while also teasing out the hidden words underneath. As you adjust the angle of the parchment, you notice more ghost letters. Slanted, faded, barely visible. You tilt your head. Now your neck is a palimpsest of regret. Reading the old layer is like trying to decipher writing left behind by a shadow. It shifts in and out of view depending on the light, the angle, and your level of existential patience. You dab the page gently with a cloth to clear away dust, revealing a sentence. The birds of the sun do not weep like men do. Well, that's not about fasting, and it's definitely not St. Basil. You realize this old layer 1 might be a poem, maybe even pagan. That's probably why it was scrubbed away. No place for feathered sunbirds in a monastery cookbook. You find more fragments. The river sleeps beneath the teeth of night. She drank stars until her silence burst. Do not name your children after storms. This is getting good. You glance around. No one's watching. You lean in closer, eyes squinting. Historians still argue whether most palimpsests were reused due to economic necessity or to suppress undesirable texts. Some were heretical writings, banned philosophies, or even scandalous love poems. Others were just old and irrelevant, recycled like yesterday's scribbles. But the irony is this: the erased layers once thought lost are now the most valuable. Entire ancient works, Aristotle, Archimedes, early Christian sermons, have been recovered from reused manuscripts. Modern technology with ultraviolet light and imaging software can now read what time tried to forget. You, however, have only a candle and your rapidly drying eyeballs. The top text tells you not to eat garlic on Thursdays. The hidden one talks about moon thirst and barefoot longing. You decide which one you prefer. Another fragment emerges. The ink remembers what the knife forgot. You sit back. You stare at that line for a while. It's probably poetic nonsense. Or maybe it's a whispered complaint from a scribe buried beneath generations of edits. Either way, it hits something in you. Something sore. Because the more time you spend in this scriptorium, the more you realize this entire place is a palimpsest. Every page holds echoes. Every desk bears old knife marks. Every monk is layered over another. Even your own thoughts, jokes about cheese dreams of sleep frustrations over ink float just beneath the surface of your prayers. You write down the legible text. Carefully, dutifully. It is admittedly very boring. If lentils be soft on the third boil, they are suitable for fasting. Good to know. You pause. Then in smaller handwriting beneath it, you add, and also the birds of the sun do not weep. Just in case someone finds this page again, hundreds of years from now, squinting in a lab or whispering to a camera on YouTube, your finger traces a line of faded ink that spirals off into nothingness. You wonder, what did this parchment used to be? A love letter, a prophecy, a dream. You'll never know. But you can feel it there, that quiet defiance, and it comforts you. Later that night, you ask Brother Gervais why they keep assigning you to these odd tasks, indexes, marginalia palimpsests. He smiles faintly. Because you're the one who doesn't look away. You're not sure if that's a compliment or a warning. Back at your desk, you start another palimpsest. This one is worse, barely any visible writing, and a weird greasy patch near the top. You sigh, but as you adjust the parchment in the candlelight just barely, you catch a single word in the old layer. Begin. You stare. Then you do. The sky outside the scriptorium has turned the color of cold iron, and the wind slips in through the cracks in the stone like an uninvited guest. But you're inside, warmed by candlelight, your fingers ink-stained and your mind full of ghosts. And today, for once, you're not copying, not illuminating, not scraping or rubbing or indexing. Today you're binding, not metaphorically, literally. The manuscript you've worked on for weeks, months maybe, is finally ready to become a book. Not a scroll, not a loose stack of folios tied with string, but a real book. With covers, with spine stitching, with heft. Brother Lucas oversees the bindery. He's built like a wardrobe and speaks like a whisper. His hands are scarred from decades of knives, needles, and hot glue, and he smells vaguely of wax ink and whatever glue was made from today. He shows you how to prepare the quires, the bundles of folded parchment sheets, usually 4 sheets per quire, meaning 8 folios, 16 pages. They're nested like sleepy birds. Yours have been gathered and pressed for days beneath a stack of stones, making them flat and disciplined. Now it's time to sew. You start with linen thread, strong but soft. You punch holes along the spine of each quire, using an awl carefully spaced, evenly measured. Then, with a curved needle, you begin sewing them together, one bundle at a time. Through the holes around the cords in a pattern called kettle stitching, which sounds cozy but feels like fighting a spider. It's fiddly, delicate work. The needle pulls smooth at first, then snags on a thread. You hiss quietly and try again. Lucas nods. The book resists its final form. That's how you know it's ready. You smirk. Philosophical binders, of course. Once the quires are stitched, the cords are tied off and trimmed. Then comes the spine glue is brushed along it, mixed from animal hide, and something that smells faintly like regret. The glue sets slowly, and you press it flat beneath a weighted board. Next up, the covers. Wooden boards cut and sanded. Heavy, solid. You pick them up and feel the satisfying thump of their potential. These are oak scavenged from old furniture. The grain is visible, the texture rough. No varnish, no polish, just raw, resolute wood. You fit the cords into tiny grooves cut into the board edges. These cords are what anchor the text block to its armor. You glue them in place and clamp everything down tight. The press groans slightly, like a beast settling in for winter. Now for the leather. Soft, dark brown calfskin soaked and stretched and cut to size. It smells rich and earthy like someone tanned a forest. You brush glue along the outer boards and spine, then slowly press the leather into place, smoothing it around the curves, tucking the corners like a gift you're afraid to give. You carve channels for the clasps if you're fancy. You're not. This one just gets leather ties. As the glue sets, you work on the final touch, the title. Not a printed slip, not gold lettering. Just a short phrase scratched with a bone stylus into the leather Psalterium Westgate. Simple, quiet. The finished book is solid, square, heavy as a newborn lamb. You pick it up with both hands. It creaks slightly, like it remembers being a tree. You turn a few pages. There's your ink, your headings, your sleepy goose bishop. The hand you forgot you had. Historians still debate whether monks saw binding as craft or ceremony. Some say it was the most sacred act, literally enclosing the word of God in armor. Others argue it was grunt work handed off to anyone with enough finger strength not to stitch themselves to the table. But here's what you know. This is the moment when the scattered becomes whole. The loose pages, the marginalia, the smudges and stains, they're now part of something with weight, with shape, with a name. It feels final, comforting, like breathing out after a very long sentence. Brother Lucas takes the finished book and places it gently on a shelf beside dozens of others. There's no ceremony, no trumpets, no whispered prayers, just a quiet nod. A shared moment of tired pride. He glances at you. You'll bind better next time. You smile. You probably will. As you leave the bindery, your hands smell of leather and wax. Your fingernails are filled with glue. Your spine hurts, but you feel oddly lighter, because now there's a book in the world that wasn't there yesterday. A book that holds not just prayers and psalms, but you. Your hours, your errors, your hidden doodles and red-letter saints, your nearly illegible colophon, and your best attempt at a decorative R. It will sit on that shelf for decades, maybe centuries. Maybe someone will read it. Maybe they won't. But it's here. It exists. And that's something close to a miracle. The final hours of your time in the scriptorium are marked not by the loud clang of bells or the solemn droning of chants, but by the quiet rhythm of tasks winding down. The benches have fewer occupants. The scratch of quills is less frantic. There's a kind of hush that feels almost sacred, like the monastery is holding its breath. And you've been given one last task. Dusting. Yes. After months of copying, binding, indexing, and illuminating, you are now the official duster of books. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly clean, but it's essential. The monastic library is a fortress of shelves. Not the vast stone labyrinths you might imagine, but tall wooden cases holding books older than many abbots, each one bound in leather, stitched by hand, and lined up like sleepy soldiers. Brother Lentius hands you a cloth and some sweet-smelling oil made from lavender and old beeswax. Gentle hands, he says. Books remember bruises. You begin at the top shelf, careful not to sneeze. Dust clings to every surface, gray, delicate like ash from an invisible fire. Each book you clean carries its own weight, its own story. One smells like vinegar, another like candle smoke, a third faintly like fish. You do not ask why. As you clean, you notice oddities. One book has a page tucked inside an unmarked folio folded 4 times and browned at the edges. You open it slowly. It's blank, except for a single line at the bottom. Who finishes a book without first thanking the silence? You glance around. No one saw you open it. No one saw you smile. Dusting leads you deeper into the library. Some books are chained, literally attached to the shelves with iron links to prevent theft, which seems overkill, until you remember that a single manuscript could take a year to make and cost more than a horse. You wipe the covers, straighten the spines. Some titles are in Latin, some in Greek, and some are just symbols. One book has no title at all, only a carved hand pointing upward. You leave it be. It feels like it's watching you. Historians still argue whether the chaining of books preserved knowledge or restricted it. Some say it symbolized divine authority books as holy relics, too precious to be trusted to human hands. Others see it as a necessary evil in a world without printing presses. Either way, you understand the impulse. These aren't just books. They're time capsules, memory vaults, and the dust on their covers. That's not neglect. That's evidence of waiting. You finish the shelf and move to the next. Your fingers are gray. Your sleeves smell like old cedar. And in your mind, you begin to replay all the strange steps that brought you here. The ink-stained hands, the snail-fighting nights, the sleepy marginal owls, the whispery poems buried beneath sermons about lentils, and most of all, the endless quiet repetition. The steady act of turning language into permanence, of resisting forgetfulness with parchment and ink. You clean one last book and spot something unusual on its cover, a tiny burn mark almost invisible. In the center of the spine, someone once carved a tiny star. It's not a title, not a symbol, maybe just a flourish, maybe a secret. You run your thumb over it, and something settles in your chest. This is the work. This is the legacy. Not the grand names or the fiery sermons, but the hidden gestures. The unnoticed labor, the soft, persistent effort of people who stayed when it was cold, who wrote when they were tired, who argued about ink recipes because they believed words were worth protecting. You look around the library one last time. There are hundreds of books here, and now you've helped make one of them. It may never bear your name. It may never be read again. But somewhere inside its spine, inside its margins, you left yourself, and the dust will remember. The candles have burned low now. Only the faint flicker of their light remains dancing gently across the stone walls. The scriptorium is silent. The ink has dried. The books are closed, and you weary scribe have done enough. Take a moment to let your breath slow. Feel the weight of your own quiet labor. Your hands may not be ink-stained. Your eyes may not ache from squinting at Latin. But you've traveled far tonight across parchment and time, through halls of whispered prayers and half-laughed doodles. There's something beautiful in this ancient, almost forgotten world. A world where time moved slowly. Where a mistake meant scraping a page, not pressing backspace. Where even silence was written. And now you're here, with all that softness lingering around you. The candles grow shorter. The wind outside quiets. Somewhere in a forgotten monastery tucked into a hillside, a goose bishop naps in the margin of a psalter, and a cat with a harp plays the final chord. You've earned your rest. Let the ink fade from your thoughts. Let the ghosts of parchment return to sleep. Let your breathing deepen slow and even like the turning of a final page. And as you drift, remember this: the work is done. The book is closed. And everything you carried with you tonight can be set down. Softly now. Sleep well. Bye-bye.